full-time service, May 6th, 1966. I had 4 years and 4 months of active duty in the United States Marine Corps. I joined the service because I've always wanted to be a Marine, and my brother-in-law he was a Marine also, and he was always pushing on me to join. He says, "Come on, Mike, join." And I figured, okay, so that was one of my big instrumental great people to get me to join the service, and I'm glad I did.
Okay, where'd you go?
Well, I started off in boot camp down in Parris Island, South Carolina, the famous Parris Island.
Anybody see you off?
Yeah, my brother-in-law saw me off. After that, I think it was 6 o'clock in the morning. The bus picked me up, and I always remember he got on and he says, "Oh, good luck." He says, "Mike," he says, "I hope you're going to have a good time the next 4 months." And he kind of laughed, and I had no idea why he was laughing until I got down there.
And what town did you leave from, by the way?
Torrington,
Okay.
Connecticut, yeah. And we went by bus to Hartford, and then we stayed in Hartford Armory, the Hartford Federal Building, and where the Marine recruiting office was. And he went through all kinds of paperwork. We already had our physical a couple weeks before that. And then we left on train in the afternoon, and we slept over, and we got to Parris Island, South Carolina, about 4 o'clock on the next day. And then we started the Marine Corps boot camp. And Marine Corps boot camp was about, I think it's 4 months. It was 3 months of Parris Island boot camp, 12 weeks.
What was your reaction to the first day?
Yeah. Well, George, it was funny. We got off the train, and we got onto a bus that took us to what they call Yamasee, South Carolina, which is part of Parris Island. And then while we're on the bus, this drill instructor came in. He says, "Okay, any of you Marines," because there were civilians there too, "any Marines, step out." So we stepped out, and then we started to get yelled at, and got to run around and do this, do that. From that bus, we went on to another bus that brought us right into Parris Island. And then we just went to some kind of a building where they manifest enough people to get a platoon out of us. And it took about maybe a day and a half to get about, I think it was 30 or 40 guys. I had forgotten the numbers. And once they got those particular numbers, then that's the day we started boot camp as far as training.
And what took place?
Well, the training, the first thing we had to do was go get your famous haircuts. And so what that was, it took about maybe not even a minute per person. They went by with a pair of shavers, and they just shaved your hair right down to nothing, and they did it again, so you didn't have not even a stubble. And then from there, we ran over to pick up our clothes, which consisted of our, back then we called them fatigues, now they're called BDUs, but back then they were fatigues. We got our boots, our socks, and all the gear that we were going to wear for the next 3 months. And then from there, we continued on, and we went to Chow. I can't remember exactly the first day what we did, but it was continuing yelling and screaming. That's what the DIs did. They were noted for that. And we just ran around, and like you said, we're our new parents for the next 3 months. And they were. They kept us squared away and did a lot of crazy things. They made us do a lot of crazy things.
How about the food the very first day?
Food was, the first day was pretty good. I remember we had a chicken. I remember what it was. I still remember. It was chicken, and they had mashed potatoes and squash and salad. And they had skim milk or regular milk. And I was a little on the heavy side. So what they did, they said, okay, this is the fat man's platoon. Basically, we were with the same group of guys, but it was just, we knew that we were the fat man, basically. We weren't really fat, we were overweight. So we had to eat a special diet and a special table. So they made sure that we weren't eating the regular food. The food was good, but we just couldn't, like instead of having whole milk, we had to have skim milk. And we had to watch, we couldn't have seconds and that type of stuff. And they helped me out. I went in 196 pounds, George, and 12 weeks later, I came out 172 pounds. and a lot leaner than what I was, and a lot thinner. I felt good.
And how about the calisthenics and all the rest of it?
Calisthenics, oh geez, I remember seemed like every hour. Okay, guys, you're not walking fast enough, or you're not doing this fast, or you're not doing that fast enough. Get on your hands and knees and give me 20 push-ups. And then pretty soon it was 30. And naturally, you can't do it when you first started. I probably can get maybe 15. And he says, you're not doing it now, do another 15. So you try to do another 15, and they would do that to everybody. And what they would do is they would always pick on the individual person. Nobody got left off. So I could be squared away as ever, standing there, and maybe I just might have twitched my head a little bit when I was at attention, whatever. And they would say, okay, Fyler, Private Fyler, front and center. And I would say, reporting as ordered, sir. They said, go down and give me 50 push-ups, or run around the compound 5 times. I says, okay, you know what that's for? I said, I have no idea for. No idea, sir. He said, because you moved your head and you did what you were supposed to do. And then they would do the same thing. A couple hours later, there'd be another person that would get picked on. That's how we went through the whole boot camp.
And how many weeks again?
It was 12 weeks. Yeah, and each week was segmented. Maybe halfway during the 12 weeks, we were probably put on KP duty, which was your famous your kitchen duty. We had that for a week, and that was anything involved from peeling potatoes or cleaning pots and pans, and with this Brillo pad. We had to do that we all took turns, but we did it for a week. And then about a month before we graduated, maybe about 8 weeks into boot camp, we went to the rifle range, and that was for 1 week. And we had to get up 4 o'clock in the morning, and we had to go and practice, holding our rifles and knowing how to shoot them and how to load them. And then for the last 3 days of that week, we went out and we did some firing.
How did you get to the range? Did you walk?
No, we
Truck?
we took a bus, because it was quite a ways out. It was about maybe 5 or 6 miles away from the compound. Then once we got out there, then we walked everywhere. We walked from the barracks, the particular barracks out there, to our rifle range. And that was, we had to be out there by 5:30 in the morning, because at 6 o'clock, when they said 6 o'clock, the first round went out. And we started off at a 200-yard prone position. And then we went 300-yard prone position, but then with you're standing up and you're just shooting with no have any brace on. You're just trying to shoot, and that was the toughest position, because what happens is, they say, you don't realize this, but your body, your aim goes like in a figure 8. So you had to make sure that you knew when you pulled that trigger that it was right where it should be. And then it got up to 500 yards, which is over a quarter of a mile, and just prone position only. And the targets were bigger, and we had to shoot. And I became an expert.
Had you fired a rifle before you entered the service?
Never did. Never fired a rifle in my life. But it didn't make a difference, because even the people that did, they still trained you the Marine Corps way, and everybody had to learn the right way. And when they said to make sure your safety is off, it better be off. One time, a gentleman didn't have his safety off. So what they did is they brought him up here in front of everybody. They said, this is why it's important that you have the safety off. Somebody could have got hurt. We didn't. Okay, so now, because this gentleman didn't do what he was told, he's going to put his finger, his thumb, into the inside of the bolt action of the gun, the rifle. And then he brought back the bolt and he let it go forward, and it slammed right into the guy's thumb. And he said, he pulled away. He says, I don't think you're going to do that again. And he says, no, sir. That was the Marine Corps for you.
So where did you go after graduation?
Yeah. After graduation, we had 4 weeks of advanced infantry training, which was in Camp Geiger in North Carolina, which is part of Camp Lejeune. And we stayed there, and we fired every type of weapon that the infantry would fire. We had to fire. We did submachine guns with a 50 caliber, We did the 30 caliber. We did flamethrowers. We did the BAR, which is a semi-automatic machine gun, and then our rifles. And we had to learn how to throw grenades and everything that we would learn how if we had to go in actual combat.
How many weeks again?
That was 4 weeks, George.
And
then from there we went home on 10 days leave, and then we got back the middle part of, what was it? I'm going to say the middle to the end part of September.
I got to stop you for a minute. Did you communicate with your family the entire time, or vice versa?
Good question, George. Boot camp then, compared to now, because my son was in the Marine Corps also, he joined in 1990. But when I went in 1962, there was no communications except for writing a letter. That's the only thing. There was no phone calls, nothing. And what we did is the communications back home, I try to write a letter, maybe 3 times a week. And Mom and Dad would write a letter. And that was really a morale booster when you got mail. They had mail call, and they would say, okay, everybody round up. And he would have a handful of mail. And he says, okay, Private Fyler, and you go up and get your mail. And Private Peterson, and so on. Some people never got mail, and some people got 2 or 3 a day. But I got, on the average, with my friends and everything, maybe 3 or 4 a week, which was enough. But that kept you going, because that's the outside world. So we knew there was something just besides boot camp there. And so my parents knew that, so they wrote quite a bit. And all my buddies wrote me too, a couple of the girls that I knew.
And then
after I got back, after we left Camp Geiger, we went home on a 10-day leave, and I got back at the end of September 1962, and I reported to my first assignment, which was the second.
I have to interrupt you.
Yep.
What was your parents' reaction to seeing you in full uniform? They hadn't seen you for a while.
Right. Oh, they couldn't believe it. I came home on bus, and from there I took a taxi from the bus station in Torrington. I took it up to my hometown, up to my address. And Mom and Dad were in, and it was at night, and I think about 8 o'clock at night when I got home. And they knocked on the door, and they didn't expect me. When they saw me, they said, oh! And my brother and my 2 sisters are there too, and it's almost, gets me choked up. It was nice to see people after your family after 4 months, which you haven't seen, you know. It was nice.
Right.
And the cab driver said, you don't have to pay nothing. This is on me, so it was good. So we stayed home for 10 days. I stayed home for 10 days. And then I left, and I reported for my first assignment, which was E Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines down at Camp Lejeune. And we were on assignment, and we just did daily, everyday activities. And then, as everybody knows, about 3 or 4 weeks later, they had the Cuban crisis. But we didn't know how heavy it really was. So we had the liberty. In other words, we could take off and do what we wanted to do on the weekend. So a friend of mine, we went from Camp Lejeune, and we thumbed our way out to Raleigh, North Carolina, because they had the North Carolina State Fair. And we stayed out there for a day and a half. And on the way we're coming back, 2 MPs drove up, and they says, guys, where you stationed? Because we were in our civilian outfit, but they could tell by our haircuts that we were military. We told them we're at Camp Lejeune. He said, you guys are a long way away. They want you back as soon as possible. What for? We can't tell you. Just get back. So we thumbed our way back. We got back around midnight. And they said, okay, everybody, as soon as you get back, get in your fatigues, and that's it. And we did that because what it was the Cuban crisis in October of 1962. So we had to clean out our barracks. And believe it or not, we slept outside our barracks for 2 weeks while the barracks was spotless. And then from there, the middle part of October, I believe, we left and went to Morehead City, North Carolina, which is your debarkation for any Marines. The ships could dock there. And we were on a transport, the USS Sandoval. And from there, we went straight down into just off the coast of Florida. And then about a week later, while aboard ship, we got closer to Cuba because of the Cuban blockade. And what that was, I think everybody knows, there was missiles that were aboard Cuba or on the shores of Cuba, and we wanted to make sure, like they had promised, that they were going to ship them back to Russia, which they did. But we, being part of the ship blockade, made sure that the ships heading away from Cuba towards Russia kept on going, didn't turn around again. And then they had ships further north of us intercepting any ships southbound from the Soviet Union to Cuba, stopped them and made them turn all around. So we were there for about 3 weeks, and the last part of October was very, very hairy. It was close. We came this close to going in and for an invasion, but thank God everything worked out good. We had a strong president, President Kennedy, did his job well and strong, and everything turned out all right. So we stayed about another month, making sure that all the missiles.
Now, where did you stay that month?
Yeah, everything was on ship, George. We were on ship on the USS Sandoval for I think about 6 or 7 weeks, and just before about the middle to the end part of November, we got back to Camp Lejeune just to make it before Thanksgiving.
So you didn't go ashore at all during that period?
No. But what we did was we made 4 or 5 mock landings, and because you're on a troop transport, what it was they would throw these nets overboard from the ship, and they would land into a smaller boat called a landing boat or / Mike boat. And I was a net handler along with another gentleman, and both of us stayed on both ends of the nets. And we had the highest part of the ship, the bow, and we had to climb down. We each had to go down evenly, otherwise the net would turn on you. So we got down onto the bottom of where the ship is, where the boat was, but we had to be careful because the waves would come up and lift the boat up maybe 3-4 feet high, sometimes 2 feet, all depends how the swells were. We had to time it, so as soon as it started to come up, we jumped off the rope nets onto the boat. Then we had to hurry up and move the rope nets away so we wouldn't get our feet entangled. And as soon as we got off, and then 4 men would come down evenly, and then we had more men until we had about 30 people aboard the boat. And then the boat would move away from the ship and would just stay there. And then eventually when we had enough to make a landing, even though this was a mock landing, they would go around in a big circle, maybe about a half mile wide. They go around and then they say, okay, lined up for the assault. And they would all line up in a straight line heading towards Cuba. But naturally it was just mock, we didn't have to. But in the real thing, that's what we'd have to do. But it was very cumbersome because back then, George, your life preservers weren't your Mae West. They were big, heavy K-pop with the pillow type of thing, and your head's always bent forward. It was very uncomfortable, and you had to stay on that for maybe 3 or 4 hours until we got back onto the ship via the ropes would come back down again. We had to climb up the rope ladder, and then we had to help the other guys back up again. The boat was emptied, and we did that 4 or 5 times during the 6 weeks that we were there. And the USS Sandoval was very crowded. It was, like I said, it was a troop transport. I forgot how many people we had aboard, and it was packed. So it was, you go down to where we slept, and you had 4 or 5 guys above each other sleeping on hammocks type of bedding. And it was very stale air down there and stenchy. So a lot of us slept up on topside. We did that if we could. In bad weather, we had to go back down naturally. So we did that. And the food, everything was hydrated on the ship because they couldn't have enough room for, the regular food. So we had a lot of, hydrated milk and powdered this and powdered that. And we made it. No problem. We do.
And then where did you go?
After we got back to Camp Lejeune, we stayed there. And then I got home for my first Christmas in the service back in 1962. We had an 8-day leave, and then we got back just before New Year's of 63. And then in 1963, we made a Mediterranean cruise for 6 months. And it left, again, Morehead City. And I think it took about 7 or 8 days to make it across the Mediterranean. And we got to Rota, Spain. And then we were to relieve the 6th Fleet. The 6th Fleet is the fleet that goes around the Mediterranean. And they will guard anywhere from northern Africa to Turkey and all your southern European countries. And we met at Rota, Spain, and we would relieve the old 6th Fleet and we become the new 6th Fleet for 6 months. And while we were there, we made quite a few landings. We went quite a few countries and islands. I remember the landings that we made was in the island of Crete, which is owned by Greece. And it was the most beautiful island. We stayed there for, I think we were there for 5 or 6 days. And I could just remember the mountains, the little small villages with all had the whitewashed the buildings on them with the thatched roofs. In a very poor country, very, very beautiful country. And most of the people there worked as herding. They would either cattle if they were lucky.
Did you have any liberty at all?
No, not there, George. Not we on the island. On Crete, it was just bivouac. You know, we just slept, and that's all we did. We just marched along and did mock warfare with other outfits. You know, we did that, and that's what we did for the 4 days. And then the other landing was in Sardinia. We did that at the end of February of '63, and when we made a landing, the landing craft fell short of the beach by about maybe 10 yards. It hit a sandbar. So the ramp went down and we ran off, but we ran into water up to our waist and some of these short guys up to their chest. And the water was cold. And we had to hike and stay in that uniform until it dried out by itself. And it was really bad because it got a very cold rain and they had to cancel out all the bivouac activity. It was so cold. And while I was myself, plus about 60% of the people that were on Sardinia ended up with sore throat. I can't think of the name of it. Real bad.
Laryngitis?
Laryngitis, yeah. Laryngitis and strep throat. We ended up with that. And then there was about, I think, 90 cases of pneumonia. So it was just poor timing.
Mm.
That was in Sardinia. And then we made a landing on the island of Corsica, which is owned by the French. And we had a mock warfare with the French Foreign Legion. And the reason with that is, George, the French Foreign Legion, at that time, they weren't allowed to go back to mainland France. I believe it's something to that. So they had to stay in Corsica. That's where they had to stay for the rest of their lives because they were out in Algeria. And I guess from Algeria, they brought them over here. There was a lot of dissension. I don't know the full story on it. But anyways, they had to stay there all their lives. And so we did mock warfare with them. And that was very interesting. That lasted maybe a day.
Did you see any of them?
Yes, we did. Yeah, we see them. We met up with them after and stuff, you know. And they were the French Marines. And they did a pretty good job too. But not as good as the Marine Corps, U.S. side did. But
And still no liberty.
Still no liberty, no. Every one of these 3 islands that I mentioned, George, there were bivouac. So there you don't have no liberty. We just went and, we camped out. We forced march. Sometimes we do 20 miles, sometimes 15. And sometimes we just hung around all day, whatever, just waiting for further training exercises. It was very interesting. But on the good side of it, I spent a lot of time in a lot of the countries there. And they were in Rota, Spain, Barcelona, went to Naples, Italy. And while in Naples, Italy, I went to Pompeii. I went to the Isle of Capri.
On liberty?
Yes, on
All
Liberty.
right.
This is all on Liberty, yes.
Tell me about your reaction to what you saw and the people.
Yeah, the people, yeah, it was first. It's funny because the first time I saw any foreigners when I was over in Spain, in Rota, Spain, and it was quite interesting just to you could try to hear them talk in their languages, and it was very interesting. And the culture was nice, and I love geography, and I still do. So I picked right up on it. Every one of the countries that I went to, I really picked up on their cultures, and I was a firm believer in when in Rome, doing as the Romans do. No matter what country I was in, I tried to fit right into with the society, and it worked out good because the people like that. So from Italy, we went down to, like I said, we went to the Isle of Capri, and we did Sorrento, and then we went to Greece. We went to Rhodes, the island of Rhodes.
All right, liberty in Greece?
Yeah, this was all Liberty. Yeah, we did Liberty
All
in
right.
Athens, and we saw a lot of the ruins in Athens. And then the most beautiful country we stayed in, believe it or not, was in Turkey. And we were in Izmir. And we were on, not bivouac, we were just on duty. We could do what we wanted to do, you know. And We had a great time there.
Did you have Liberty there?
Yeah, we had Liberty there. Yeah.
What town or city was that?
I couldn't think of the word, George. Yeah, Izmir, Turkey. And that's the third largest city in Turkey. And then we did we had some R&R, which is relaxation. And what we did was we went to a little village called Marmaris, Turkey. And it was the most beautiful place I've seen in the Mediterranean. Now it's on the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but what it was all these hills with these beautiful pine trees came right down to the beautiful blue Mediterranean. And there's a big beach there, and we had a nice party where we had, some hamburgers and hot dogs and volleyball and baseball games, and we'd go swimming. But the water was so clear. I mean, if you went out deep enough, you could see right down to the bottom, 30 feet. But the surrounding area was beautiful because all these, like I said, these high hills, these small mountains came right down to the water, and beautiful pine trees, just like Alaska, right up to the water's edge. So it was nice. So the Mediterranean cruise was nice.
Then?
Yeah, after 6 months, we came back.
Back to where?
Yeah, I came back to Camp Lejeune again.
All right.
And then from there, we were there for about a month, Camp Lejeune. And then what they do, every summer they have new assignments. And they had, you could volunteer, or they would pick you if you need any volunteers to go to certain places. And they had, you can go out to, the place they had was California. They had a place in Puerto Rico. There's Iceland. There was Newfoundland. So they needed, I think, say 3 or 4 for Iceland. So I figured, you know what, I'm going to take that one. So I said, I'll pick Iceland. So I was the first one to take it. They said, okay. So you sign up for it, you sign your name up, you take it, and then maybe 3 weeks later, they say, okay, you're all ready to go to Iceland. So we left the company there, E Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, which was my home for close to a year. And we went home on leave, and then we came back, we went to McGuire Air Force Base, which is in New Jersey, and we flew. It's the first time on an airplane, George. This is in August of 1963. We flew up to Reykjavik, or the Keflavik, Iceland, which is about 30 miles from Reykjavik. And Keflavik was a naval air station. And what we did up there was a guard duty because they had atomic warheads up there in these bunkers in Keflavik. And then every so often, we were lucky enough to go up to Whale Bay. And every other month, I volunteered to go up. So we went up to Whale Bay. And
how'd you get there?
By bus. They bussed us up. And we stayed and we guarded these big, huge 100,000-gallon oil tanks that Esso owned. They were embedded into the mountainside of Whale Bay, Iceland. And that was nice duty up there. Very mountainous, very nice. No trees up in Iceland, but I loved it. I had a good time. Nice into town. It was Reykjavik was a very nice town. Back then, it was only 75,000 people. Now I think it's over a quarter million people now. And I think that's one of your number one spots for tourism today is people going up to Iceland. But back then, in '63, it was a lot smaller, and you didn't have your liberty like you could do now.
You make me wonder what the source of food is for the Icelanders.
Yeah, good question. A lot of the Icelanders were fishermen. In back '63, I was up there for 1 year, from August of '63 to '64. In that time frame, the fishermen did very well. They had a very good economy. And I think they made on the average about $10,000 a year, which was good money in them days. And a lot of cod. Everything they went after was codfish. And for our choice of meals, we had codfish or mutton. And if everybody has lamb, a lot of people, they don't care too much for lamb. It has a little distinct taste. Well, mutton is 10 times worse than lamb if people don't like lamb. And it was not too tasty. So we had a choice of that or cod. So we had one day we'd have steamed cod. The next day we'd have mutton. If we don't want mutton, it would be baked cod. Or it might be broiled cod or boiled cod. Everything was codfish. You had your choice. So once in a while I got tired of cod, and I go to mutton. And after I had that, I'd stay with codfish for 2 days. And that basically was what our supper was. And maybe once a week, we'd have some kind of a Swiss steak, what they were doing, you know. And then for Thanksgiving and Christmas, they had the real wonderful.
Apparently, even a potato one can grow up there.
Yeah. No, they didn't have potatoes up there, but we had quite a few spuds, as they call them,
Right.
came in from the United States. But when they dropped off the fish, they would drop it off in a 2-ton dump truck that they would get from Reykjavik, and they would just back it up and they would just unload the fish right into the back of the mess hall. And the fish were about 60, 70 pounds of cod. They were huge, big heads on them. And they would take care of it and fix it up for our meal for us, and that was it. They did that once a day.
Now you mentioned whale. So did you have any whale burgers?
Yes, we did. When I was up at Whale Bay, what they did, they hunt, not fish for whales, because hunting for whales is a mammal. So they used to hunt for whales, and they'd harpoon them, and they'd bring them to the Whale Bay, which was a big processing plant, and then they would get one whale, and they would put a big hole in where the body meets the big back fin. There's a strong part of the body, and they would put a hole in that with a guy wire, and they would pull up the whale backwards up onto this big, huge platform. And they had these Icelanders that had razors, and they looked just like hockey sticks, but they were razor sharp all the way around, really razor sharp. And they would take it and they would start cutting the blubber into strips. They would cut one, and then they would go down about maybe 3 feet or 2.5 feet lower. They would cut another strip. Once they got a strip cut, then they would put a hole in it, and they would get a guy wire, and they would pull off that blubber. It was usually 9 to 12 inches thick. All depends how fat or how big the whale was. And they would pull it away from the body, and you could hear it going peel away. And then once they got it peeled away, they would cut it into a cube, so it would be, let's say, 3 feet by 3 feet. And these gentlemen had spikes on their shoes because they needed them, because in the platforms on both ends, they had a 4-foot round hole. And they would just throw in the blubber, and it would go down into a big tank. It would boil into liquid, into oil. And then the other end of the platform was another big hole, and that was for all the meat. And they grind that up and use it for, some people would eat it as like a hamburger, the Icelandic version. Some people, it went to a lot of European countries. They did a lot with that.
What source of heat did they use to heat it up?
Everything was done by steam, especially back in Keflavik, in Reykjavik especially.
Were they burning wood? Or?
No, what they did was they had a natural geysers. They had natural steam there. So what they did, they would harness all the steam. Now, even back then they did it, but even more so now, they harness all this steam, George, and they would bring it into individual houses, just like your gas, except this would be piped in, and this is how they heat their houses. And they never run out of steam. It's natural all the time, and there's no emissions, and it's great. And speaking of whales, I had whale steak, and it was the cheapest meat in the world. We picked it up. We were up at Whale Bay. We picked up a slice, and let's say it was a piece of pound and a half, 8 cents a pound. And it tasted just like, almost like a Swiss steak. It didn't have a beef steak taste, but it didn't have a fishy taste either. Even though they live on plankton, I can't remember it being fishy. It tasted different, but it was delicious. Good fish, or good food, good meat. What it was, it wasn't a fish.
I bet most people don't know that.
No, they don't. No.
So where next?
So after I left Iceland, which I wanted to stay, I wanted to extend for duty up there, but they said, no, you can't. My last 2 years I spent down in Norfolk, Virginia, from August of '64 until May of '66. I spent down in Camp Elmore, which was in Norfolk, Virginia, and I was an MP for 2 years. And that was interesting. We did a lot of, we were internal. So what we did, we just guarded our base. I wasn't one of the revolved. Sometimes they have walking MPs that would go around town taking care of all the sailors and the Marines who got in trouble downtown. I had to take care of them. I wasn't one that part. I was just aboard the base. So we just had security. We, made sure that the people had their passes and going in and out of the base. And we'd sometimes have to do. It was on the honor guard. So if any dignitary passed away, We'd have a 21 gun salute for them at the cemetery or wherever they were buried. We did that. And I liked the MPs. It was nice. It was a day on, day off, weekend on, weekend off.
I assume you had some liberty there.
Yeah, we did get quite a bit of it.
Tell me what you saw.
Yeah, well, a lot of my friends, they lived out, and I had a good friend. In fact, I'm still friends with him. He's out in Pennsylvania. And almost once a month, we go up to his house. Because every other week, we had duty, so we couldn't go. So every other week, or most of the time, we head up towards York, Pennsylvania. We did that. And a weekend up in Indianapolis one time, and a weekend in Columbus, Ohio, and all over. My friends wanted to take me up to meet their families, so it was nice. We had a good time. It was nice, nice last 2 years of my career.
So you're approaching discharge day.
Yeah. Approaching discharge day, yeah. We counted down. We had a calendar and marked 100, and what you did, you colored them down: 100, 99, 98, 97, and so on. And then when you get down to the last week, you figure, okay, this is it, And I remember my last day there. The guys took me out to the club, and we had our final goodbyes. We had a nice party, and next morning I got up and got in my civilian clothes and went down. I saw the officer of the day, and he says, okay, Mike, he says, congratulations. He says, sure you don't want to stay in? And I says, I'd like to. I said, but I got better plans on the outside. I said, 4.5 years in the Marine Corps is enough right now. So he gave me my discharge papers, and off I went. And I remember walking down to my buddy. He's going to give me a ride to the airport. And I'm walking around. He drove me around a lot of the base. It was kind of a small base. And I said goodbye to all my buddies that I saw the night before, And going out the gate, there was a group of guys that waved to me as I was leaving the gate. And that's the last time I've been down there, but I'd like to get down again one of these days. It was nice. And my 4 years, 4 months in the service was fantastic. I don't have any gripes whatsoever. The Marine Corps was good to me. Hopefully I was good to them. And I never once complained about the food. You kid around with it, this stuff. But you know what? Didn't cost, was free. Didn't cost you nothing. And what they had to work with, especially back in the early 60s when I first got in, I think it was 78 cents a day. They had a cost for it to feed a person. So, you're not going to get Swiss steak every day with that. But the food was nice and no complaints.
And your discharge date, do you remember?
Yes, was May 6, 1966. That's when I got discharged.
All right. So how did you actually get home?
On the way home, I had called up my buddy who lived in Pennsylvania at the time. And I said, hey, I'm on my way home. I'd come up and see you. And he says, funny, I was just thinking of you, Mike. Come on up. So I went up and spent 4 or 5 days with him and his family up in York, Pennsylvania. And then from there, I went up to back home in Torrington, Connecticut.
By bus or train? How did you do that?
I went by bus all the way up till I got home.
Anybody meet you?
No, I got home. My parents worked, so I always like to, I like to visit them when or go home when they didn't expect me, surprise visits, So they would be working or be late at night by the time I got home, and I'd be thumbing. I always get the old magic thumb, and it always seemed to work for me, especially in uniform, So that worked out good for me, George. And I don't know, you want to go into civilian aspect?
Oh, yes,
okay.
Sure. What did you do after you got home?
Then I worked right away. I worked a week later, not even a week, 3 or 4 days later, I had my buddy said, I need a job. So somebody got me on road construction. So I did that, putting in sewer piping in Torrington. I did that for 2 months. And then I started to get itchy. I said, you know what? I said, I want to do something else. I want to go somewhere else. So I had a buddy who lived up in Canada, Hamilton, Ontario, which is just outside of Toronto. And I called him up. He said, why don't you come up? He says, we'll see what we can do up here. And I said, sounds good. So I went up and met him. This was November of 1966. Met him, and I quit my job, and then he quit his job a couple days later, and we took a train from Toronto, Canada, to Vancouver, British Columbia. Or actually, the first one was Edmonton, Alberta. And that would be equal to Buffalo, New York, to let's say somewhere in the northern Montana. That's how it would be equal in length. And we took a train. The train, I still got the train ticket over here. It was $45 for a train. And it took us 3 days to get there. It cost $45, and I told that to people today, and they said, if you still got that ticket, you could get yourself a lot of money, because now they want close to, like the Orient Express, almost $1,000 a day. You know, if you a sleep-in booth
Right.
with food, that's the Orient Express type of traveling, if you're doing the same travel today. So anyways, we did that, and it was just beautiful. Went up to northern Ontario. We got into Manitoba and Saskatchewan. We ended up in Edmonton, Alberta. And we were going to go up and work up at the Peace River Dam, which was up in the northern part of Alberta, but they weren't taking any, just nationals. They weren't taking any foreigners, which the U.S. was. So we decided to go a little, well, okay, we'll go out to Vancouver. So we took a train, and that train was $35 from Edmonton to Vancouver, British Columbia, which is absolutely beautiful. It was mountains once we left Edmonton until we got down to Vancouver. And this was in 1966, so it's a little different now. But even then, I remember Vancouver being a beautiful, beautiful city. And I was there last year, and it was really, I mean, it's really fantastic and built up. But it was a nice train ride. And then we stayed in Vancouver, didn't find a job, so we went over to Seattle. We were looking around there for a while, and couldn't find a job, so we ended up with my cousins down in Los Angeles, or Long Beach, California. And we stayed with him for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then we got our own apartment, and we had our own job, and then I joined the GI Bill. I got on the GI Bill, thank God, and I went with them for Long Beach Community College for, I think it was, maybe, for a semester. I did that. And then my buddy, he went back home to Canada, and he couldn't find a job, and he said, he wanted to go back home again. I stayed down there for another year, then I eventually got back home to Connecticut.
Okay, did you have a job then?
Yeah. Back home in Connecticut?
No, down there.
Oh yeah, down there I worked at Douglas Aircraft. Yeah, that's in I think it was Longwood or Long Beach. Not
Doing what?
I was, I got on this machinist training program. And that was very interesting. They needed machinists, so I signed up for it. So I went to school full-time, college full-time, and I did this full-time. So when I got second shift, so when I got out of work at 12 o'clock, midnight, I hurried up home to my apartment, had to do my homework, maybe got to bed 3 o'clock in the morning, and had to get up at maybe 8, 9 o'clock and start my college again. Had to do that, schooling again. Did that for 6 months, so it was kind of tiresome. But I wish I could continue with the schooling, which I didn't. And then I eventually said, okay, I had enough of California. So I came back and went back home to Torrington and worked up in, I worked on construction for a little bit. Then I worked over at Colts Manufacturing. I was a M14 rifle inspector, or M16 rifle inspector over there. We used to have to inspect the rifles at Colts.
And after that?
Yeah, after that I met my wife in 1967. In September 7th, 1968, got married. And,
you mentioned the post office.
Yeah, oh yeah, then from, right after I got, just before I got married, in fact, just before I got married, I got into the post office in Hartford. And I wanted to become a letter carrier, but they only had room for a clerk. So my father-in-law, he was a letter carrier himself, he says, Minor, why don't you just take it? He said, take it anyways, he said, because then you can get your foot in. So I took a clerk's job, and we stayed with that for 2 weeks. Then he wanted volunteers to be a carrier just for the summertime, and then you go back clerking again. So I took that, and I worked out in East Hartford for a while. And then finally, by luck, I got into the clerk craft, or the carrier craft. So I started carrying mail, and that was I started my career in 1968, the post office.
In East Hartford?
In East Hartford, and I ended in 2005. I had, with my service time, I ended up with 42 and a half years of the service.
And while you were working at the post office in East Hartford, where did you reside?
Yeah. I was in Wethersfield. We lived in Wethersfield at the time. We stayed there for, I think, 2.5, 3 years. And then I moved to Newington. We have my wife and 2 children. And the children grew up and went to school in Newington. And that was from 1972 to 1990. And then in 1990, I moved out in Farmington, where I live now. Been out here 22 years.
And how did you wind up in the Avon VFW?
VFW, I ended up, was it 3 years ago? I have to tell you another big aspect of my service life, but answering George's question. 3 years ago, I went to a service they had at St. Anne's Church in Avon, and I saw Bill Newman, who was the commander, post commander then, and they had a nice ceremony there. So I went to the ceremony, and after I came back and had coffee with Bill and people, and I said, geez, I'm thinking about joining. So right away, they took my name and everything. I remember him and Don Peralt, and they got the information, and I told them the only thing is, my DD-214, I don't have anything, me being in foreign service. So I told him, I said, everything was on the USS Sandoval. So he wrote everything down. It was in the Cuban crisis. So Don Peralt called up that night, and he says, oh yeah, he says, he called me back. He said, got good news for you. He had called a gentleman that was down in, head of the VFW branch down in headquarters, down in DC, and he said, anybody, and he read it, anybody who was stationed or was aboard the USS Sandoval from October of 1962 to November 1962 got the Expeditionary Medal, sailors and Marines, and I was on it. So I didn't have it on my DD-214, but he told Don, he says, this gentleman of yours, meaning me, he said, why would he lie? He's 67 years old. He's not going to be lying now, so he's in. And then we got proof later on that I was in, but that was nice enough to give me the green light to get in. But I have to say that in 1978, I joined the Army National Guard, and I had stayed with them for 8 months. And I said, I have some buddies that were in the Air Force Reserve, and they said, come on. No. So I got out of the Army without using a day's pay. This is in the reserves now. I went into the Air Force Reserve of January 1979, and I stayed with them for 20 years, and up at Westover. And that was very interesting too. We were with civil engineers, and we were all over. Because we were civil engineers, and we needed to did a lot of building, a lot of not too much road construction, but a lot of building and plumbing and electrical and all that stuff. We got invited over to a lot of these overseas bases. And while I was in the service, the 20 years I was in the reserves, I went to England. These are all 2 weeks now. Germany. Then I went to Italy. Then I went to Spain. Then I went to Panama. Then I went to Alaska, which is considered overseas duty because it's so beautiful up there. Then we went to Germany 1, 2, 3 times. So I would say half of my 20 years summer camp was spent overseas. Yeah, those are all the countries. Oh, then I was down in Honduras too for 2 weeks. So it was nice, and it was very nice to see how the people live and how they work down there. And most of the times when we were, anytime we were on our 2-week encampment, we just had to put up buildings, and there'd be, maybe or renovations, or we did something to that effect.
Well, Mike, I think you have a fantastic story. It was my pleasure to interview you today at your lovely home. So thank you very much, Mike.
Well, thank you, George, for you coming over here and spending your time with me. I appreciate that very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.